bookworms, and happy Filipino Read Fest. Today we are joined by Paolo Chikiamco, editor of Alternative Alamat, and Eliza Victoria, author and one of the anthology's contributing writers. Paolo Chikiamco is a Filipino writer of prose, comics, and interactive fiction. He is the editor of Alternative Alamat, Myths and Legends from the Philippines, and the co-creator of comics Myth Space Ignition, A Sparrow's Roar, and Murals Within Magical Walls. Eliza Victoria is the author of several books, including the Philippine National Book Award-winning Dwellers, the novel Wounded Little Gods, the graphic novel After Lambana, a collaboration with Mervyn Malonzo, the science fiction novel and stories Nightfall, the short story collection 17 Prayers to the Many-Eyed Mother, and the poetry collection What Comes After. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in several publications, and for more info, you may visit elizavictoria.com. Today's moderator is Carljoe Javier, who is currently the CEO of Pumapodcast, which makes award-winning and socially impactful podcasts. In addition to that, he is an author who has published in a number of genres, and he teaches creative writing at Ateneo de Manila University. Let's welcome the amazing Paolo, Eliza, and Carl.
Right. So thanks everyone for coming to watch this, and thanks Eliza and Paolo for taking the time to have this conversation. Um, I wish we were all somewhere, no, maybe fully booked in BGC, hanging out, bugging each other at each other's tables at a stall. But at some point, hopefully
Next
we'll
best
get
thing.
there. The next best thing. This is the next best thing, I suppose. So I'll get the ball rolling, and one of the things I've been thinking about, as a writer and as a reader, is something that's reflected in the book, and something that's mentioned in the introductions, which is that we actually know Western mythology. And when I say we as a people, right, we know Western mythology better than we know our own. And parang the simple answer naman is colonialism. But I'd like to dig deeper into your own personal experiences and ask what story, experience, interaction, whatever it may be, what's your exposure to Philippine mythology versus that standard education that we all get? Paolo, we can start with you.
I mean, it's no secret that for me, my first exposure was really through Arnold Arias' mythology class. And just to flash my old cred and geek cred. I mean, I'm talking about the original floppies, the oversized comics, not these Johnny Come Lately graphic novel. No, nothing. Just kidding. Um, it was the first time I'd really seen them in a world building kind of way. You can hear some stories here and there, especially lower mythological stories, but I'd never seen it before placed as an integral part of world building in a comic or a fantasy setting. So that was my introduction to it, and that was the first time I also not only to Philippine mythology in general, but to Philippine speculative fiction and to Philippine comics. It was a lot of things for me, and it really opened my eyes to the possibilities. And once you know it's there, um, you can find. I mean, it was much harder back then, pre-internet days. Again, with the age cred, but if I
Yeah,
hadn't seen
maraming tayong age questions.
if I hadn't seen that story, I wouldn't have even known to look. I wouldn't have known that it was possible to do those things. So yeah, that was my awakening, so to speak. You can blame Arnold for that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad that it's got a new version with Tuttle, because it was that influential to me, and I think it will be that influential to a lot of people as well.
I think ang beautiful lang ng idea na I wouldn't have known to look, and these artists guiding us as artists. How about you, Eliza?
um, Speaking of dating ourselves now, I take great pleasure in saying that I think I'm the youngest person in this room.
Why would
Um,
we do this to ourselves?
Congrats, I guess.
I mean,
It's not
that's a
always
low
the case.
bar. It's not
I know.
exactly, you're not
This is
exactly
not
talking to
always the case.
millennials here. Oh,
Yeah.
technically I'm millennial. I mean, technically we're millennials, right? Like
Yeah.
at the edge of it.
No
Anyway,
comment.
sorry.
Doon na lang, no comment. Um,
Yeah, so back to the question. I have greater affinity to lower mythology, I guess you can call it, because it's part of my lived experience growing up. Those are the stories that I hear from my own parents, my relatives in the province. So I know about yung kapre, diwata, sirena, mangkulam, mga ganon. But not so much our own deities. I am not familiar with our pantheon. Growing up, it's not taught to us in school. I know more about Greek and Roman mythology. My entry into reading in English um, is through encyclopedia volumes. So it would have, topics about Greek gods, Roman gods, that sort of thing. So um, just thinking back to my childhood, I know next to nothing about our own Philippine mythologies, which sucks, and says a lot about our own education system, I guess.
so my turn na bumawi sa'yo kasi you just said encyclopedia, and that, I think that also tells us how
I
old you
know.
are.
World book yan, world book with a gold foil.
Tree of knowledge.
I actually had a follow up for you, Pao, and we can sort of jump in
Yeah.
with this. But when you said like you wouldn't have known to look, I'm wondering, hindi naman sa tell us your age, but I'm wondering what stuff were you reading at the time, and what was the shift in imagination for you? Was it like, whoa, there's this big world out there that
I
I'm
mean,
not?
I was
Yeah.
I was reading um I was reading speculative fiction novels. I can't remember exactly what novels I was reading then. Was I in my David Eddings phase, my Terry Brooks Shannara phase, or I mean, for those of us who were readers at more or less that time, you knew what was on the shelves. There was not a lot of variety there.
Mm.
Um, there were a lot of books, but a lot of those books were just from the same guy. So um, I was reading some comics. I think I'm sure I was reading comics because I found mythology class in Comic Quest.
Mm.
Shout out to Vin. And I think that I was reading. I'd already gone through my mythology kick, the Bullfinch mythology compendiums and all that. So again, like when you're a young reader and you don't travel a lot, your world view without the internet and not a lot of cable TV, your worldview is basically the bookshelves that tells you what the rest of the world is like. And as far as I'm concerned, the only mythologies that were there were the Greek ones,
Mm.
the Norse ones, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that was mostly it, and then the fantasy novels, and that's why I wouldn't know where else to find what I was looking for. I mean, there weren't a lot of libraries. There wasn't. I didn't have ready access to anthropology departments or lectures or anything like that. I was a kid in the 80s. You know, there wasn't. So there was really there was nowhere to look. There was nowhere for me to stumble upon these things. Philippine mythology was stuff that you had to intentionally look for. It wasn't something that, I mean, unless you really lucked out in the book fair, it wasn't something you would run across in the store or the school library or on the street somewhere. Which is why I guess one of the good things about the city boys and girls like me who did engage with Philippine mythology afterwards is that it's always been a relationship of choice. We weren't, this isn't like how in other states where you have these more unified pantheons, they are very easily purposed, repurposed into like a nationalistic mythology, into something that develops national identity. That's why they teach it in schools. That's why they have all these symbolism. Here, it's not that way, and that has benefits and that has costs. But one of those benefits is that those who engage with Philippine mythology do so by choice.
Mm.
It's not something that was foisted upon us. It's not
Mm.
something that we are carrying on because of inertia from our school days. It's something we awoke to,
Thought. Yeah.
we consciously looked for, and we found. It's a choice that we made to make it part of our identities as people and as writers, and that's not something that everyone can say.
I kind of love the idea of the evolution of this and readership and what's available. Also, I think next to like superhero stuff, di ba? The overlap for us with this kind of subculture that you had to search for, and now it's much more easily accessible. So, kids these days with all their access. I wanted to move this over to Eliza, and ask about, because you were saying that this the supernatural, the
Mm.
mythological, they were just a part of lived experience or
Yeah.
the life that was happening around you. And then
Mm.
I think I'm old enough now. I remember when you were, I remember meeting you as like an undergraduate poet. And I didn't know you as like a speculative fiction writer, but as that. So I'm wondering, at what point do those kinds of stories begin forming, for you, having had your literary upbringing, literary training? What point did you want to start writing about mythological stuff?
I was writing poetry and speculative fiction at the same time, to be honest. I think yung poetry got like like more exposure, at least in the literary community, because of the awards. Those are the pieces that got awarded, and I remember when my name came up, no one really knew who I was because I wasn't in that circle. I'm not even a creative writing major at the time. I was a journalism major. Now, in terms of writing about Philippine mythology, at least from my own experience, before I wouldn't even think about writing about the Capri or the Diwata or anything like that, because they're just part of my family's stories. So in a way, they're kind of sacred in that sense. Like, I can't imagine touching them and including them in fiction. Like, they're not fiction fodder, sort of thing. But then, when I moved from the province to the city for college, um, there grew a sort of distance, I guess. So they're not as sacred anymore to me. So they became part of my imagination, and then maybe then I was thinking I can access them for my own creative writing pursuits. So that's when it started in earnest. When I moved to the city. Yeah.
It's so parang in the same way that in fantasy kailangan mo may separation, ikaw rin as an author, you needed some level of separation.
Yeah. I was just going to add, it's strange because, well, in marketing or stores, there's this rigid, separation between realist and realist. But in my mind, since I grew up with those stories and they were told to me as real, as things that happen in the world, I never thought of them as like speculative or non-realist. So I guess I also needed that distance to be able to think of them as quote unquote just stories. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the kind of the kinds of stories that are discussed here, because
Mm.
what I found recently, sometimes someone says, and this is young writing majors, and they say, gusto ko magsulat ng Philippine mythology. So, and then their only solution is to put like a tikbalang, a kaper, and aswang, and then give it like werewolf or vampire characteristics and just go with the
Mm.
story. And what I found really interesting here, um, was that, Paolo, you sort of selected stories not just of lower mythology but also parang yung sorcerer's queen and some of the may bathala may gods involved.
Yes.
um how do we sort of develop a deeper connection to our mythology then, apart from maybe alternative alamat being a first step? Do you see readers and potentially authors dipping in? What are their next steps? Read this book and then what's next?
After they buy like 10 copies, well,
10 copies, give it to a bunch of people, and then start
yeah,
reading groups. Yeah.
yeah. No, actually, when I made the call for submissions, I was very specific. I wasn't looking for lower mythology.
Yes.
At the time, that's been done. I mean,
Mhm.
that's your the folklore creatures. That was something that a lot of people would use constantly, and that's not what I was looking for. Remember, I was a
Mm.
Bullfinch mythology kid. I was looking for. This was around the time that I started Rocket Capre. That was the website I ran for a long time, and I put together this list, one of the first ones online, I guess, called the Philippine Pantheons, which was just I gathered all the books that I'd been able to acquire through licit and illicit means, and took the names of anything that even vaguely smacked of divinity, put them in a list, put
Mm.
them with a location from where they were taken, and then uploaded it as okay. These are our Philippine pantheons. That's what I was looking for. I was specifically looking for those kinds of stories of named characters in mythology, as opposed to just generic creatures. Like if there was some, like Celestine did something about a famous named Tikbalang, that's fine. I was because then we're talking already about a different kind of world building than you're talk when than the one you get when you're talking about folklore creatures that you repurpose into creepy crawlies or
Mhm.
monsters of the day. So these things, I guess, one way of putting it is that what I started writing for, what I started what I the reason why I did the anthology, the reason why I write most of what I write is always to fill an absence.
Mhm.
In this case, it's the absence of Philippine representation in the kinds of stories or the kinds of books that I like. In this case, that book was a book of mythology, a book of something like Bullfinch, something, but of course, not just as a straight retelling. I wanted it to be an adaptation of um, these old stories of, I wouldn't say higher mythology, but of the gods, of goddesses, of these kinds of anitos, dewatas. That I wanted to sort of cover ground that I hadn't seen covered yet. So at the time, there weren't a lot of themed anthologies. At the time, the focus was on lower mythology.
Mhm.
So at the time, there was not a lot of stuff on Philippine mythology. So that's why that was the focus. It's not a kind of residence that you can force. I think I can say, I can reveal that it was hard. I didn't get a lot of submissions that fell within the criteria
Mm.
because most people were not used to this. Most people were not used to, because this was the time of like the PSF anthologies where Dean and Nikki would just as long as it's speculative fiction, it's
Yeah.
considered. I was very specific, and not a lot of people were used to writing for specifications. Um, and that sort of, but so it was tough to get those stories, but at the same time, it also went to the reason why that kind of anthology was needed. So it's not something I. But the hope is that after it was done, more people would realize what was out there.
Mm.
They would have an awakening similar to the one that I had with Arnold's work, and go out and seek those stories, go out and make new stories. And that's something that can happen because there is, at least from what I've seen, a certain resonance, that a kind of belonging that you have when you encounter Philippine mythology as a Filipino, even if and even as and even if you're aware of the fact that even if these are quote unquote Philippine myths, if you don't come from that specific community, you have to engage with them in a sort of alienated way as a kind of half outsider because that's not your community. You did not grow up with the stories of Melu. You did not grow up with the stories of Kaptan. You're not part of that community, even if you're all Filipinos. And there has to be an awareness of that. And yet, even so, it's special to encounter these stories from these islands that, by reason of colonialism or politically drawn lines on a map, come from people you are bound to, people you identify with, at least more so than the stories from Europe or from Japan or from anywhere else. There's something there usually. I can't really identify why or how that is, but it's something I experienced personally. I've seen other people experience it too. And that's why those were the kinds of stories I went for Alamat. And that's why I think that when there is something to be said for showing these stories to Filipinos and to the rest of the world.
Given how Paolo's talking about the call for submissions,
Yes.
how did you run across the call for submissions, and how did you personally feel or respond to it when you read those? And then you can add on.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, to add on to what Paulo said. For example, things that have been done before, like the aswang, the idea of the the folkloric entities that we know. We have them, stories of them in spades. We have them in pop culture, in our movies, horror comics, and all that. Whereas I grew up watching Xena, the warrior princess, or Hercules. So, yeah. So in terms of the call for submissions, I can't. Oh, it's been so long ago. I can't remember now how I came across it. Probably, maybe Facebook, or I saw it on the Rocket Capri website.
I probably sent it to you personally.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, like you had a story in PSF 4 or was it 5? I already knew you when this was going
Okay,
on.
probably 4. Yeah. So
Yeah, so the
maybe it's like a solicited sort of
yeah, because
email.
I was having trouble, so I really made sure to email specific people that
Yeah.
okay, please give me something.
Yeah, but I do remember looking over the Pantheon list on Rocket Capre, and some of those gods and goddesses I've never even heard about. I grew up in Bulacan, so I'm Tagalog. My mother is from Cagayan Valley, so she's Ilocano, Ibanag, and yeah, some of those deities are not even familiar at all, and some of them have descriptions that are just maybe a line or two. So there's a lot to be there's a big gap to be filled in terms of story, and I think I've always been fascinated with thinking about the idea of loss, losing something, losing someone. So that's why I guess felt an affinity to Anagolay in the when I saw her name in the list. And there's nothing much about her, so I ended up putting her in a pawn shop, and having her interact with all the other gods and goddesses that I don't know much about, and just giving them in a way that gave me free reign to give them their own personalities, and just have fun with it, just have fun with the story. Yeah.
So it was a solicitation that prompts you to write the story. It wasn't something that was there already.
Sitting in I don't think so. I don't think I have it in like the back burner or anything like that. Yeah, and it it became quite an important story to me, and a phrase from that story became the title of my first short story collection. So, yeah. And
And
even now, new readers would like message me about that story. Like that's how they found me, sort of. So, yeah, it's a good place to start, I guess, for my own writing.
and so so this is a reprint, but we have an added new story from you.
Yes. Yeah.
What's the story behind that story? How much time passed between the writing of it? What prompts that? And is it like a, diba, we have some overlapping characters, but for you as an author, was it like solicited again? Tell us the story lang.
I have a feeling this is also solicited again, Paolo.
It was solicited. I
Yeah.
admit
Yeah.
it.
So,
I needed a
um,
fatter book.
so I think at that point I've already written Wounded Little Gods, which also features a number of Tagalog gods and goddesses. So I'm happy to go back to that world sort of for the second story. And it's around memory and trying to overcome trauma um, given time. I can't remember how far apart they are now. I
This
don't
was
know. I'll have to check my emails.
this was a couple of years after.
Yeah.
Like the print
Probably.
version from the digital version was about I'd say 2 years.
Oh yeah, So probably 2 years apart. In terms of a change, the first story is from the perspective of a teenage boy who's in love. So it's very very light, I guess. It's still about loss and tragedy, but the voice is very just light and happy and open to having magic in his life, sort of thing. The second story is a bit more melancholy. So I guess that's the main change between the two. I don't know if that corresponds to my life or my way of thinking about the world in a way, but I did notice that my writing is getting kind of darker as the years go by. So maybe that's the biggest change.
Sige, I will pry further if we have more time. Um, but throwing it back to Paolo and the editorial process, um, what what are the things that you look back on the original work that you did in putting out the call and soliciting and selecting? What do you feel you got right? What are you proud of with this book now that it's 10 years later?
I mean, I'm proud it exists. I mean, this was like my first one. I mean, not counting Ruin and Resolve, which was the charity anthology, where I mean, it's for charity, so I mean, there's no expectation, and there wasn't a lot of editing that I would actually do. I was more a collator, but this was the first thing I ever edited. The first time I was ever an editor of anything, comics or prose or any of that. So that's a big ask for someone who was just in his I was just starting, really. The website had just started. I had just been a few years writing speculative fiction myself. um it's one of the things that is great about looking back at Alamat now is you can see how there were a bunch of us who were starting at more or less the same time. Lisa, myself, Raisa. Um, Mervin was just coming out into his own. We probably I can't remember if Tabipa was even with Visprint yet at this point, but he was also just starting. So it's kind of amazing to see go back and see. I mean, of course, we had some old masters there as well, but there's also a group of people there who were just starting out. Not all of us um, did anything further in the genre, at least not that I know of. But there was a bunch of us who are still at it now, and it's amazing to see way back. Looking back, I mean, the only real thing that I could advise myself is to stick with it, and that it will be worth it. That it would find its place and have merit. Because I mean, I was just doing a lot of work on my own, because the first one was the digital published version.
Mhm.
So like all the promotions were just on me. A lot of the proofreading was on me. Um, I was doing back and forths with. I mean, some stories were fine as is. Some we had to do back and forth, and then there were some that, because I wanted to have more stories, I had this group of stories where there was, I mean, a lot of work was being done to see if we could make it fit, and for a few of those, in the end, all that effort, and we couldn't find a place for the story, and that's disheartening for me. It's heartening for the author, and there were times where I felt I was in over my head. Not a lot of people who are first time editors um, jump in with a book from the start. So there were times that I would have just given it up, because if not for the fact that that would set a really bad precedent for anything else I would do in my career. I mean, if it hadn't been my first, maybe I would have. It was very hard, but I persevered, and I would. If there's anything I could have said to myself, just if there's anything I could say to myself back then, it would just be to do that, to persevere. That it would be worth it in the end. That I wasn't gonna it wasn't just going to be something that was totally torn apart by everybody else in the community. I mean, I was a new arrival to the speculative fiction community at the time too. I was the Johnny come lately. I was the, if Eliza talks about not being known because she wasn't in, a creative writing major, at least you were majoring in something to do with writing. I was a philosophy major who went to law school. These people didn't know me from Adam. Like, um, like nobody knew me. So it was but the community was very
I
welcoming.
knew you, Pao.
Eventually,
I knew you.
but I met most people at, like, what the I met most of my Philippine speculative fiction friends at the launch of Philippine
Yes.
speculative
That's
fiction
Yes.
that's true.
before.
That's true.
Yeah.
Before that, I was not I was a non-entity. Um, so it was daunting, but the community was very welcoming. I had, like, Mia and Joey took me out to lunch. Mia Tiam, Joey Nasino, they took me out to lunch, and they explained that, don't be scared. We got your back. You don't, no one's gonna mess with you just because you're new. It'll be fine. And it was fine. So if I could calm myself, I would. But maybe I also wouldn't talk to myself in the past, just because I don't want to mess with it anymore. It turned out okay. But time travel stuff. If I go back and give myself confidence, might not end up okay.
You might
So
grandfather yourself out of it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if you guys want to speak to this, but one of the things that struck me, reading this collection in 2022, is actually how progressive some of the politics are. Particularly it's yung gender politics niya is progressive for this moment, which means that it was very progressive for its time. And I'm wondering, how much awareness was there, intentionality there, or is this something that just emerged from the stories that came through and their modern retellings?
Hmm. You want to take this first, Elisa?
I'm just thinking that historically we've always been progressive, like, indigenous Filipino culture. So I think if you are mining that kind of knowledge, that nation's knowledge, it will have to be progressive. The stories that you come up with, compared to what happened after colonialism, where everything just became shit. Yeah. So that's what I think. That at our at our core, we are progressive. Um, we have yeah, we hold the woman in high regard, sort of thing, or the babaylan, when you think about it, is, I guess, non-binary when you use today's um terms. So I guess, yeah, if you are coming from that kind of worldview, the stories will appear progressive. Yeah.
For me, that's the kind of story that you tend to get when you ask for retellings of the
Mm.
old stories. because one of the one of the ways you deconstruct the story is you ask, because all stories have something to say about the society they emerge from. And these are old tales from very different societies. And even if there are areas where in the treatment, let's say, of women was more progressive than, let's say, in the West, a lot of the values are still very old and not the values we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, an egalitarian society might be one where they allow women to be warriors, but the values are still killing's okay. So when you ask for people to retell an old story like that, especially myths and legends, which deal with the values usually of that society, you will get authors who will look at that and see that the easiest focal point from which to pivot the story would be the different sense of values we would have in the modern world. You can see that pretty clearly in the very first story, Richitas, which is why I put it there, because like almost every culture has a star maiden,
Yeah.
and almost all of these star maiden myths are misogynistic as hell. So it's one of the ways that I wanted to be upfront and show from the start that we will respect these stories. These stories matter, that they're ours. But we are not the same people that these stories were meant to sort of encapsulate. Those gods who were worshipped back then, for the most part, do not represent values that we would embrace now for good reason. Heroes back then would behave in a certain way and be seen as heroic. We see now that this is abuse. We see now that this is violence. These are things that you will get when you start engaging with these ancient stories, these ancient tales. And that's one of the reasons why it's a good thing to do, because you have to wrestle with these things about it's a beautiful past, but is that past something that we've moved forward from, or have we moved backward? And each story, each person each author would engage with that story with their own truths and in their own ways. That's why I think a lot of the stories in the anthology end up being progressive, because the way they reimagined the story was by definition subversive to those old values, because they were already bringing in and viewing these narratives through the lens of modern values.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I like how you're both playing on. It's like Eliza is we started out as progressive, and here in our retelling of these myths, we necessarily need to have a subversive view of them. I'm gonna have to start winding down. I have just two shorter questions for us to go through. One, uh, in the time that that from the time since this book came out, I know that you have both done a ton of work. Are there mythologies, creatures, etc., that you are still super excited about that haven't touched yet, that you're still figuring out what kind of story you tell around them, or is there a specific character or god that you want to explore?
Mhm. Do we really need to show our cards like this? It might steal
Kasama,
my
kasama,
idea.
kasama siya sa questions eh.
So I'll take this one first. The ones that I want to explore and that I will explore sometime in the future, hint, hint, wink, wink, are the agents of Titan. Um,
Yeah.
Amongst the beings of the Tagalog mythology, a lot of them only reach us now as names and dominions. But with the agents, for some reason, they have pretty vivid descriptions that have managed to reach us of their looks, their powers. You have Manggagaway, who goes around pretending to be a healer so that they can um, induce maladies with their charms. You have Manisilat, who specifically is meant to be like the breaker of happy homes, someone who I guess just doesn't like seeing all those normies with their happy relationships. You have Mangkukulam, who for some reason gets specifically mentioned as, okay, this is the only guy here. So I don't know why that's important, but apparently it is. Who has a sort of magical flame that will kill once it's extinguished. And then you have Hukloban, who, and again, the way they're described, it's just weird. There's always some sort of relation. Like Hukloban is described specifically as, oh, she's more powerful than Manggagawa. It's like, do I, okay, I guess? Is someone overcompensating for something here? And then they describe her as someone who can kill by simply raising her hand. So there's a lot of rich description here, and there's a lot of questions like, why are these four described together? Why are they sometimes described in relation to one another? Like, you can already sort of get the inklings of some sort of politics going on here. And why, out of all of the other mythological figures, why do we have so much detail about them where everybody else gets one line? So they're a group that I will delve into in the future. The next book I have coming out in title, which is Muros, will deal with the agents in some way. So that's something hopefully I can continue to do because I think there's a lot there.
Um, that's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to read that, Paolo. For my part, I feel like I have explored quite a bit of the Tagalog pantheon, I guess, through the stories that I've already written, like Wounded Little Gods. I'm thinking for my next novel, it might be um, a sort of mythology that I'll create on my own, sort of, because I wanted to look into cosmic horror. Um, yeah, and around the idea of sacrifice and all that. So not so much Philippine mythology, but in if given the time,
Wow, you
if
are
only I had,
you are really getting darker with age.
yeah. If I had the time and energy to do so, I would like to write something about Bernardo Carpio. Because I don't think I've ever tried writing anything about our folklore heroes, like, yeah, Bernardo Carpio or Lamang sort of thing. Yeah, maybe do a gender swap. Yeah, could be
And
interesting.
yung sacrifice and aging, no? Kasama sila. All right, so to close it out, yeah, this is a celebration of you guys having an international edition of the book. Is there specific kind of conversation that you want to start, or with an international audience? Is there a goal for you as editor, as author?
Elisa, go ahead.
There's, I guess it's equal parts excitement and nervousness about this international edition, not only for Alternative Alamat, but for my other books as well. Um, it's always great to have representation because because at the moment I'm in I guess being in Sydney and being around like some spaces where it's mostly white people, it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't feel like living, it feels like performing because you may be the first Filipino they've ever met, sort of thing, and you're being used as like a gauge for the rest of the archipelago. So I guess what, in terms of conversations that I want to start with an international audience, is the Philippines is not a monolith, and Paulo says that right in the introduction. We are the Philippines is a group of many islands, many languages, and many cultures. So whatever they read in our stories, in the collection, it's just a starting point, really. So yeah, and I hope it just makes them more curious and more aware.
I mean, it's always good to see more Filipino books on the shelves, period.
Yeah.
Whether they're from us, whether they're internationally distributed, whether they're locally, all of that. Like I mentioned earlier that you know the bookshelf is a worldview. It's a window that shows someone. I mean, even now in the age of the internet, it it shows that if you're on the shelves, it is you're a potential gateway to a reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for the longest time, there was no gateway here.
Mm.
The only way you get to the Philippines is you get on a plane and you travel here. That's what I hope our books can do. That's it's less a conversation
Mm.
because I don't know, like once the books are in their hands, it's a conversation between the book and them. I'm out of it. At least
Mm.
is out of it. Unless they come into slide into my Twitter DMs, which has happened, but it's it's more that it's an invitation that you know I've always said before, like you write to the absence of things. We were absent for a very long time.
Mm.
I never liked that. Even when we were talking about shelves locally, there was, with the fact that you would shelve Filipino books in one side only, exclusively, it sent a
Filipiniana.
message that, for whatever reason, they didn't think that we were on the same playing field as everybody else. That our fantasy, our fiction, our comics were not fantasy, fiction, and comics that could stand next to the stuff from America, the stuff from
Mm.
Japan. I didn't like it. I never have. I still don't like it. So when we see when if the international distribution would allow us to colonize those spaces, that's a good thing. Because what I want is to invite people to visit our world, visit our culture, visit our authors. And I also want to make it clear that I don't think that Filipino writers and creatives should feel like they should always, because there's this pressure, to always draw from our Philippine heritage because we're Filipino creators. It's a pressure that comes from publishers wanting diversity. It comes from readers wanting representation. It comes from the authors feeling this guilt or obligation. And those are all good things. But your value as a Filipino creator isn't in the fact you're Filipino. It's the fact that you're a creator. And it comes from the fact that the stories in your head, you're the only one who could put those out. And whatever is inside those stories, that unique individuality is your value. And I want it to be possible for people, Filipinos or not, to see our books and say, I haven't seen that before. I want to know more. I want to see more of that. I want to write more of that. And if we can do that, whether for Filipinos or for someone in the Filipino diaspora who's never set foot here, or for someone who only knows Filipinos because of some joke they saw on Netflix,
Mm.
I want them to see that there are gateways here that they can step through to. They won't always be welcome, but they'll be interesting.
Thank you. So, thank you, Paolo and Eliza, for joining us today. And for those who are watching, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to get a copy of Alternative Alamat, an anthology from fullybookedonline.com or at your nearest Fully Booked branch. Thanks again and take care.